of what we call family ties. And what we tried to do was establish some relationships amongst some of the principal characters in the story. And if you recall, we said there were 20 some odd principal characters in the story, excluding Jesus, the guards, Pilate, and a few others. Do you remember who are some of the principal characters we were playing around with? First we have Joseph of Arimathea and his buddy who? Nicodemus. We have not 12 disciples, but how many? 11, because one is sort of out of the picture at this point, right? We have a bunch of Marys, but we're not exactly sure if we have, what, 3 or 4, okay? Because one could be the same person identified twice by 2 different names. We have some Jameses, don't we? 2. Well, we have 3 actually. We have 2 Jameses that are disciples. We have James, right? We have James the Lesser, and then we have James, brother of Jesus. Then we have Jesus' 3 other brothers who are basically notable by their what? Absence, right? And we were trying to position, and then we have a couple of other ladies, right, in the story. We have Mary, mother of Jesus. She's one of the Marys, obviously. We have Salome, who is, we'd said, the sister of Mary, a mother of Jesus, right? And also, by the way, the wife of Zebedee, which makes her John and James's mom, and by the way, Jesus' aunt, and makes John and James Jesus' what? Cousins, right? It got very complicated, didn't it, right? Okay. And then we had also this mysterious lady who hangs out at the Hasmonean palace named Johanna, right? Who turns out is the wife of one of the hotshots that hangs out with Herod. Okay? And we said Luke was probably using her as a source much of the time. So then we got to this point, we said, okay, now that we've sort of played around with all these characters and tried to figure out who's who in relation to who. Oh, I left out one more, didn't I? Right? Other Mary, not Mary, mother of Jesus, not Mary Magdalene / perhaps Mary of Bethany, right? But other Mary, her husband is Clopas / Cleopas / Alphaeus, who also happens to be, as far as we can tell from other ancient documents, Joseph of Nazareth's brother, which makes also James the Lesser Jesus' other cousin, right? And Cleopas is also the guy on the Emmaus Road. The named guy. There's another guy who's unnamed, but he's the named guy. So that's kind of where we left it off. And then we said, okay, if we know all this stuff about all these characters, can we try to figure out a real detailed version of the story here that would kind of make some sense, positioning the characters where they would be based on what the Gospels tell us, right? And can we go down deep and try to figure that out? So let's try to do that. Now, for the purposes of this, I have made the assumption, and I do not insist upon it because it can work either way. I've made the assumption that Mary Magdalene and Mary of Bethany are in fact the same person. I think that makes the most sense, when you'll start to see why, I hope. I don't insist upon that. If you want them to be 4 Marys and not 3 Marys, that's okay. You just have to realize Mary of Bethany kind of leaves the story at a weird time. Okay? Which could happen. Okay? But we're going to assume that Mary Magdalene and Mary of Bethany are in fact one. It doesn't have to be that way, though. Okay. This is some of the basic geography of ancient Jerusalem at the time of the crucifixion and resurrection. A couple things. Okay. This is where Caiaphas' house is. We are sure Caiaphas existed. Archaeology has helped us out there. Caiaphas' house is about there. Okay. We're going to put Mark's house in the vicinity. We know of John Mark's house. We know of it through Acts. We know that John Mark's mom's house was identified as the house that Peter came to when he was busted out of jail, if you remember that. He knocks on the door, they open it, and they're surprised it's him. That is John Mark's mom's house, i.e. John Mark's house. Okay? We know that there is a wealthy man in Jerusalem that lets the believers assemble, right, together, and that he lets them retire frequently to his private what? Garden. So it's presumed that John Mark's dad is the owner also of the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus and the disciples are retiring to get away from it all. Okay? I'll get back to John's house in a second. The Hasmonean Palace. This is where Pilate is, and this is also where visiting dignitaries would be, like who? Herod. And by the way, with Herod, Herod's steward, Chusa. And by the way, with Chusa, Herod's steward, Chusa's wife, Johanna, who was one of the 5 women who was identified as showing up at Jesus' tomb Sunday morning. Okay? They would have been here. Temple area. This is the traditional site of the tomb. This is where the Roman soldiers are. Okay? John's house, the Zebedee John, right? Zebedee and that John, right? The fisherman John, right? John, the disciple who Jesus loved, John, cousin John, right? They have a house in Jerusalem. Now, there's been speculation that perhaps John was a priest, what's called a Kohan, somebody that is serving at the temple periodically. That's a speculation. A better explanation might be simply that, given the market for fish in Jerusalem, Zebedee's family was keeping a location there. It is clear that there was a place that Mary, mother of Jesus, and Salome and the family, Jesus' cousins, right, were in Jerusalem for Passover. Everybody was there for Passover. This would have been the likely location. It's also clear that John has a link to people at whose house? Caiaphas' house. If you recall, who's the guy that can get into Caiaphas' house? Who's the one disciple who is able to know people at Caiaphas' house? It is who? John. Who's able to get Peter into the courtyard because of his connections? It is John. Okay? They're neighbors. Okay? So this is John's house, Zebedee's house, Salome's house in Jerusalem. James's house too. James, not the lesser. James the well-adjusted. Remember him? Okay? All right? So that's what we've got there. And then one more thing. Bethany is over here. We say, what's Bethany? Bethany is 2 miles down the road, right? It is a village that contains the house of Martha and Mary and Lazarus, right? Okay, they're down there. Okay, so we're going to try to take it from Thursday night and look in detail at where people would have been moving logically given this geography. Okay? Okay. So Thursday night we have the Last Supper, most likely here. Right? Now where are they going next? Where do they go after they eat? Out to the Garden of Gethsemane. They're coming out this gate through the Kidron Valley. By the way, it tells us in the Gospel they go through what? The Kidron Valley. So we know they went through here. And they're going to end up at the Garden of Gethsemane. Okay? So by Thursday night, late Thursday night, presumably into Friday morning, right? We have 11 disciples and Jesus here. Who is not here? Judas. He has gone, right? He has gone and basically told on Jesus. And then we can presume there's some back and forth between Caiaphas' house and Pilate, right? We know that the mob that gets Jesus has not only temple guards and people like that, it also has Roman soldiers in it from the language, okay? We also know that the Jews have no power to put anyone to death and they want Jesus dead in a very real way. So presumably they would have, there's a delay between when they go and when the guards and the mob shows up. Well, what's going on there? Most likely they're having a conversation with Pilate. We don't know this, but it would make sense, right? That they're going to try to arrest Jesus. Judas arrives with the temple guards and the Romans from Antonia Fort to the Garden of Gethsemane. Now at that point, basically all hell breaks loose, right? We have that scene where Peter does what? Cuts off the ear of Malchus, the servant, right? By the way, do you realize, if you read the Gospels carefully, that's in all 4 Gospels, but the identity of the ear cutter and the ear cuttee are completely concealed except in one Gospel. Who's the only one that tells us it's Peter? It's John. Who writes the latest? John. Why do you suppose Mark, Matthew, and Luke don't say, and Peter cut a guy's ear off? No, because they're writing early enough that Peter's still around and they don't want him arrested. Okay? All right? You understand there's an anonymity if you look at some of the early Gospels. You know who else is not also mentioned as living in Bethany is Lazarus sometimes. Right? But by the way, Lazarus is the best evidence that Jesus is what? God. Remember how the Pharisees wanted Lazarus dead too? We got to get this guy and the guy he raised. Right? Because he's good evidence. So it's very interesting when you go back through the Gospels, you see details that are added in, details in some cases that are deliberately maybe not included, because these are snapshots. They're giving you some things and not all things. All right? If you read Mark's Gospel tends to be more favorable to Peter than other Gospels. Right? Mark is great friends with who? Peter. We know from ancient sources that Mark is giving Peter's story, basically. Okay? And it's not that he sanitizes it, it's just that, he's protecting him. He doesn't say, Peter cut the guy's ear off, for example. Okay? So here they come, strike the shepherd, and the sheep scatter, right? They all get out of there, right? We have this weird scene where it's just this almost random insertion where some young guy who's wrapped in some sort of ad hoc garment or bed sheet or something like that almost gets caught by the guards and runs away naked, and you're like, why is that even in there? Okay, we're not sure. It could be that that's Mark who is writing about himself being inserted in there. It could be that that's Mark who was right at his own house, right, and followed them hastily into the night and didn't get dressed very well, and he's at the scene. We don't know, but there's this weird sort of insertion, right, about this young man who's an eyewitness seeing what's going on. The guards almost get him, and he runs away, and they grab his clothes, and it says he runs away naked. And it's just, and then you never hear about that guy again, as far as we can tell. Okay, 9 of them run away, presumably in what direction? Towards Bethany. That would be the logical direction to go. Probably all of them go that way, but 2 decide the better of it and circle back and kind of, in the dark of night, integrate themselves behind the mob carrying torches. Remember, there's no street lights, right? None of that. They kind of like come along behind them back into the city. Who are the 2 that follow the crowd back in? John and Peter. Okay? John, again, is the one who, because of his proximity as a neighbor, has connections in Caiaphas' house. So it says, the Gospels say that John goes in, right? Peter has to wait where? Outside, until basically John gets somebody to let Peter in. That's how Peter ends up warming his hands in the courtyard. Remember that whole scene? Where she says, you're one of them, no I'm not, you're one of them, no I'm not, you're one of them, no I'm... Remember that whole thing? All right, well that's how Peter got in there, okay? All right.
Don't forget the rooster crowing.
Huh?
Don't forget the
Right, twice, yeah, okay. All right, so Thursday night, the 11 escape to Bethany. Mark's nearly caught, and again, I say Mark's nearly caught. The guy in the weird bedsheet clothes is really caught. Doesn't have to be Mark, okay? Might not be, we'll never know. We're never going to know that, okay? Jesus is taken back to the city. John and Peter slip back in following the crowd. Peter does his famous 3-time denial. The rooster crows, right? Jesus looks at him. Peter's devastated. Now that's kind of important, actually, to the story. Because if you look at the rest of the story, right, Peter is out of the picture, right, until really Sunday morning, right? Okay? Peter's devastated. Jesus told him, you're going to deny me. No, I won't. Does it anyway, right? Peter is wiped out, okay? John and Peter, they don't have anywhere else to go, right? They end up back at John's house, okay? This is really his dad Zebedee's house. Zebedee is married to who? Salome, all right? The other James is with the 9 in Bethany. John's brother James is not there, even though that's his house too. He's at Bethany. He ran that way, okay? Clopas and the other Mary, okay? And Mary, Jesus' mother, would also have been there. So we've got a lot of people. The family's basically at John's house. Peter's there now too, presumably bawling his eyes out over what he's just done. Okay? That's going to make sense too. And when you see the Sunday morning story, Peter has to be there. Okay? Because when Mary comes back, she's getting who? John and Peter. Okay. All right. And we go to Friday. When Jesus is crucified on a Friday, sort of in the middle of the day. Okay. The 9 have scattered to Bethany. Mary of Bethany, who I'm presuming is Mary of Magdalene also, right? Remember, this is the lady that, either it's Mary Magdalene and Mary Bethany separate, but either one, both those Marys are devoted to Jesus like nothing else, right? They sit at his feet. They love him so much, and I'm assuming it's the same person. So she's not sitting in Bethany, right, while this is going on, right? She's coming in because she's heard from the 9, right, that Jesus got arrested. So she's freaking out. So she comes in the 2 miles from Bethany, okay? Now from the gospel, we are told that there are certain people witnessing the crucifixion, right? And among those we are told are, we have Jesus' mom, who's described as being near the cross. So maybe that centurion, remember the centurion that said, surely this was the Son of God, the guy in charge, right? Maybe he let her come close knowing it was the mom, right? John is her nephew, right? So he's also described as being near there. And Salome is her what? Sister, right? So the immediate family is kind of closer, right? And then the Gospels describe Johanna and other men and women. It says the women who had come in from Galilee is what it says, right? Which is Johanna and who knows. I have Susanna there, but Susanna should be in quotes because we don't know if she's there. The only thing we know about Susanna is she's identified with Luke in Luke 8:3. That's her buddy. So we're guessing she's there. We know Johanna was there. Susanna's a guess, okay? Other men and women. Well, what other men and women would be there? Well, we have Mary of Clopas identified there. I'm assuming Clopas is in the other men category at the cross, right? And he's witnessing this horrible event. By the way, who's one of the first people Jesus appears to after he's resurrected? Clopas, his uncle. Okay? All right? So these are the people we've described witnessing the scene. The only disciple in the bunch is John. And notable by their absence are any of Jesus' actual biological half-brothers, right? They're not there, which is why we get this very interesting scene when Jesus realizes his mother just can't take this anymore, and he basically tells John to what? Take her home. Well, does John have a home nearby? Yes, he does. Okay, who's going to go with John, presumably? Well, Mary's sister Salome. That's why she disappears from the picture for a little while, and she's not witnessing the burial. Because she's with her sister, who's at the house of Zebedee / John, right? Crying her eyes out. Okay? Okay. So there are 4 people mentioned at the burial. Who are they? Okay, well, all right. I wasn't counting them. Joseph, yeah. Who else? Nicodemus is added in, and then we've got Mary Magdalene and other Mary are sitting across from the tomb observing the burial. Okay? And the language reads basically like they're kind of watching these guys from a little bit of a distance, but watching where they're doing it. Which makes sense. They don't know these guys. They're not in the inner circle. Joseph and Nicodemus are hotshots, right? Mary and Mary are not hotshots, right? You know who is in the hotshot crowd, though, of the women? Johanna, okay? Okay, so Mark 15:47 says, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid. Kind of like they're looking a little bit of a distance. Matthew says, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were sitting there opposite the tomb. Luke, who is writing maybe from some different sources, getting some added tidbits, right, especially from Johanna, says the women who had come with Jesus from where? Galilee. That's Johanna, and we don't know, but it's Johanna. Okay? Followed Joseph and saw the tomb and what? How his body was laid. Well, to see how his body was laid, you probably had to be a little bit what? Closer. Okay, so John Wenham speculates, and I try to say every time we're speculating, okay? John Wenham speculates that, burial and anointing and this kind of thing, that was more of a woman's thing to do, okay? And we told you it was very involved, right? The chances that hotshot number 1 and hotshot number 2 were going to do this right are pretty slim, okay? So it's quite possible that Johanna and maybe some of the Galilean women went in there and helped out with their preliminary burial arrangements. And they're doing it fast because what's approaching? Sundown. And what's the next day? The Sabbath. Not just Sabbath, but it's Passover week, right? So this is a big deal. So the chances that they're getting it done to their satisfaction, we know they didn't get it done to their satisfaction, right? This is a quick hit, right? And so you could envision a scenario where Johanna and whoever's with her comes out and sees the two Marys. Now here are all these women who are devastated by what's happened, right? They want to make sure that the burial thing is done right. They confer quickly and say, let's come back when? After the Sabbath and make sure this thing is done right. Make sense? Okay, so how many sets of women do you really have? You really have 2. Right? And they're at 2 locations. Right? Which also helps us understand some of the language about when they set out. When it says one sets out when it's dark and one sets out like when it's light and so on. They're not coming from the same what? Location. They're meeting up. You understand? They're meeting up. Salome is in John's house. That's where her family is. Right? Johanna is at the palace. Right? Mary Magdalene's probably coming in from where? Bethany. They're not coming from the same original place. They're meeting up to go to the tomb. Okay? Okay. So, okay, we talked about that. And by the way, again, every time we see Susanna, we try to do it in quotes because it's Johanna. Luke says Johanna and others, right? And so she's the only other we know that knew Johanna. So we're kind of guessing her, but she's a guess. Okay? Okay. So Luke's language in the gospel is for Sunday morning is Mary Magdalene, other Mary, Johanna, and other women. That's how we arrive at the number minimum how many women? 5, right? That language insists that there's a minimum of 5 other women, okay? That are there. It could be 6, could be 7. We don't know. Okay? Okay. Got it? Good. Okay, so one of the women who's identified in the Gospels as visiting the tomb Sunday morning is Salome. Okay? And she's presumably coming from John's house. And so we have at least one woman who we can't name. We speculate Susanna simply because she's linked with Johanna. And the way that Luke positions that is the people that are the other women are linked with Johanna. So that's a good guess, but it is a guess. All right, so let's go back to Friday. Friday evening, okay, Luke 23:55 has the Galilean women following and seeing how the body was laid, okay. It is notable that Salome is not witnessing the burial. She is most likely, again, consoling her sister, Mary, mother of Jesus. John is probably also there as well. Okay? We talked about this. Okay. Now, we have some controversy that skeptics like to nitpick whatever they can nitpick. And one of the things they talk about is this issue of spices. Now, in Luke, basically, the women go home and prepare the spices before the Sabbath, which implies they already have what? The spices. In the other Gospels, they have to go procure the spices. But this actually fits very well with what we know about that time period and about socioeconomic class, which is to say that wealthy women were in the habit of having that stuff ready already. In other words, they had a stash they could go to, a spice stash, okay? Whereas other women would have had to procure it. So when Luke says the women prepared the spices as if they already had them, well, Luke's getting his through what lens? Johanna's lens. Okay, so it's very possible that they already had that available where they were. Okay? For the Marys, they had to go, it says, buy the spices, right, once the Sabbath was done. So they had to wait till like Saturday night and get spices. Okay? Now, the other thing that's to pay attention to is on Friday, most likely, Mary Magdalene stayed over at John's house because it's dark and it's a 2-mile down the road journey. Probably she stayed one night there, but she's not going to want to stay there on Saturday. Well, why is that? Well, a couple reasons. One, she doesn't live there. Two, she's got 9 guys who are probably hiding out in her house, right? With her sister, who is who? Martha, who is always mad at her for what? Not helping out and so on, right? Also, there's another person who's highly motivated actually to get to where her house is, and that's Other Mary. Because if you think about it, Other Mary, right, although she is currently probably staying at John's house, where is her son James? Bethany, right? He's one of the 9. Okay, keep in mind, when Jesus gets arrested, right, and they're all running away and hiding, think of what they're doing for days and days and days. They're hiding behind closed doors, aren't they? Why are they hiding behind closed doors?
They could be arrested.
They're terrified of getting killed, right? Okay, so if you're Other Mary, right, one of your immediate concerns is your son, right, James the Lesser, right, who is somewhere, and you don't know where he is, right, but you know that the guy he was following, right, just got killed in a really gruesome way. Okay, so what we assume is that Mary Magdalene, and it would make sense if Other Mary also were to go with Mary Magdalene to Bethany as well. Okay? That's probable. Okay. All right, so spice buying. Mark says Mary, and Salome bought spices when Sabbath was passed. And skeptics like to say, see, they're buying the spices when the Sabbath passed. And Luke says the women returned and prepared the spices. But again, we're not having one set of women. We have at least what? 2 sets of women, all right, who are not of the same socioeconomic class, not staying at the same place. Okay? No contradiction there. Okay? Okay, we got that. Good. Saturday. Clopas and his wife, Other Mary, have their son James the Lesser. He is currently cowering with the other 8 disciples, right? Not James, not John, not Peter, in Bethany. Okay? Mary lives there, assuming that Mary Magdalene is in fact the same person as Mary of Bethany. Okay? So, if you look at the Gospel of Mark, it seems that he is writing from the perspective of the women who are in John's house, which is Mary, meaning Other Mary, and Salome. Now, why does that make sense? Because we know from outside sources that Mark's gospel is really through the lens of which disciple? Peter. Where is Peter given our story here? Where does Peter have to be? In John's house. Okay, where are these women? John's house. Okay, so Mark's gospel, which historically and from the ancient writers has been consistently referred to as basically telling Peter's story, right? Well, this is the lens Peter would be looking through. Peter's at John's house. Mark's gospel reflects that lens. Just like Luke's gospel reflects a slightly different lens when it comes to this story, because he's getting a lot of his stuff from where? Johanna as one of his sources. Okay? Okay. All right. Now, when the women set off on Sunday morning, they're not setting off presumably from the same places. Okay? If our scenario at this point is accurate, we have Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, probably with Clopas, because Clopas probably wouldn't have let them walk there to Bethany at night, right, or late, right, without going there. They're setting off to return to John's house. Salome is still at her own house, right, which is John's house. Okay, Salome is John's mom, right? So we've got Salome at John's house. We've got Mary Magdalene and other Mary returning from Bethany back into the city, right, to pick up Salome. And then we have, from the palace, we would have Johanna and whoever else is with Johanna. Okay? Okay. So, presumably they come in and meet up with Salome, right? And they probably have agreed to meet at the tomb, so they're probably taking a couple different routes, okay? They're probably going out through, Johanna's crew is probably going out through this gate, right? They're probably going out through this gate here, meeting up at the tomb, okay? And then what we know unfolds, which we'll take a look at, probably unfolds in this order. Before they get there, and we're going to have to talk about the language of the Gospels, but before they get there, there's an earthquake, and the stone gets removed by the angels. Now, we'll talk about the stone in more detail at another time, but it's a really big stone. Anybody know how big the stone is, pound-wise? Estimated, based on engineering estimates of tomb openings and stones and so on. Any guesses? The weight of the stone? Huh? It is actually estimated between 3,000 and 4,000 pounds. Could be smaller, but either way, I'm going to have trouble moving it. I can tell you that right now. Okay. The way it works is it's usually like a big disc, and you say, well, how do you get that in place? They build it so it's at a slant, and they have like a wedge between it. They take out the wedge, it rolls in place. Rolling in place, easy. Rolling out of place, not easy. Okay. And so one of the things that we look at with the gospel account, the language of the gospel accounts, which we're not looking at exactly today, is that the stone wasn't just moved. It was moved way up like the hill. It was moved like way up there. So that is to say that there was no way you could fabricate an account. There was something really weird about how the stone was moved. You couldn't get a crew of guys to get the stone up there, basically. That had to happen before the women show up. And if you remember, the concern the women said they had on the way was, who's going to move the stone? In fact, Frank Morrissey wrote a book called Who Moved the Stone? Because you really got to figure that out. It's a big stone. It's designed to stay there. It's a tomb. There's no reason to ever move the stone. It's not like you have to go visit someone in there. Okay? So this thing is designed to stay sealed, and we haven't even talked about the guards and the seal and all the security and all that kinds of. We haven't even talked about that. But the stone had to get moved, and that's a big deal that it got moved, and it's a really big deal that it's way up there instead of just kind of slightly moved. Okay, that had to happen before, and sometimes we get confused because the way we translate into English, it almost seems like the moving of the stone happened when the women were there. They're showing up, and the tomb is open. Okay? Now, their reactions are going to vary a little bit to this, okay? But let's just slow down and take a look at this. I am not a Greek scholar, nor do I pretend to be, okay? But we have some things in English that are nuances that Greek doesn't have. Greek really doesn't have what we would call the pluperfect tense, which is the had been tense. You know, like I had been doing this, and then I started doing that. Right? Something that's more past than regular past. My kids at school screw this up all the time. They write had been for everything, you know, instead of like just regular past. So there's had been, and then there's was, right? Greek kind of blends those together and lets you sort of figure it out. So the way we translated it to English, it seems that everything is in the regular past tense. But that, if that were true, that creates a really weird scenario, which can't have been how it was, okay? So we need to really try to make this sound the way it ought to sound in English, okay? So for a Greek reader, it wouldn't have been a problem to figure this out. For us, when we translate it into English, all of a sudden it sounds funny, okay? So if you just did it standard English right from the Greek, it would suggest the women and the guards were there at the same time, right? Because the way it reads is it says, the stone, there was an earthquake, an angel moved the stone away, the guards fall down, freak out, almost pass out of fear, right? And the women are there. That's kind of how it reads. It's a snapshot of all these things that happened. And the Greek reader would know that there had to be a sort of sequence for that. But when we translate it into English, you get this very strange picture of the guards on the ground cowering in fear and Mary, excuse me, pardon me, it's very, which is not what's happening, okay? Also, you have the account in Matthew that the guards are going to the Jewish leaders and saying, listen, man, we don't know what happened. You've got to cover for us, right? Well, they can't be there and there at the same time, can they? Okay? Okay, so the guards, angel moves the stone, right? Guards flip out, freak out, fall down, prostrate like dead men, right? At some point they're recovering and running away. By the way, once that stone got moved, they had good reason to be afraid, angel or no angel. Once that seal got broken, that was their death sentence. Once they were fallen down, that was another death sentence. Once they ran away and abandoned their post, death sentence. Okay? They had no choice, and we'll talk about this. They had no choice but to go and try to get somebody powerful to cover for them. Because everything they did, according to their Roman orders, was a death sentence. Okay? So, the women are not stepping over fallen Roman guards. If the angels are in the tomb, you can't have one of them sitting outside on the rock. So this has to be at different times. Okay? And this is why skeptics like to get crazy with this, right? They love to go, well, are there two angels? Are there one angel? Are the angels in the tomb? Are the angels out of the tomb, right? Because unless you can get the proper sequence, you've got some problems. Okay? The good news is that when properly constructed into English, if we start using the pluperfect tense in terms of past and then more past than that, right, we can make the scenario work and read really as it should read, which is like this. And behold, there had been a great earthquake. In other words, before the women got on the scene, the earthquake had happened. By the way, I forgot, I learned this yesterday. I must have been either reading or listening or something like that. But they have now uncovered evidence in that exact area that there was a small earthquake, which they're dating between 26 and 36 AD. Which is right in the time frame. Okay? All right? But there had been a great earthquake, for the angel of the Lord had descended from heaven and had come and rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his raiment white as snow. And for fear of him, the guards had trembled and become like dead men. Okay, we could be getting this. Remember, the guards still existed after this. We don't have any record of them being killed, all right? And who knows what their lives were like after this? Who knows whether they realized, some of them, that, Jesus was Savior, okay? But we also have them reporting to Jewish leadership, right? We have members of Jesus' followers, namely Joseph and Nicodemus, who are in the inner circle. The story of the guards could circulate, right, from the guards too, okay, as far as what happened to them. We know the official story that some of them were bribed to tell, which is what? The disciples came and stole the body. You say, why would they tell a suicidal story like that? Because all the stuff that was true was also their death sentence. They had to throw a Hail Mary, right? So if they leave, death sentence, right? They let the seal get broken, death sentence. They had to go along with what the Jewish leadership wanted, because no matter what, they were under a death sentence. Sorry, Chris.
If the angel had caused the stone to be, like you said, way up on a hill where it couldn't go,
Right.
Why would the angel be sitting way up there on the stone? You get the impression the angel was sitting there, and everybody got to the tomb and saw the angel sitting there.
When the women get to the tomb, they don't see him up there. All right? One of the women, Mary, doesn't see angels at all. Okay? The angels for the women are in the tomb, and they are low-key. Right? The angels for the guards are, hello, right? Stone gone and full on angel, I'm going to scare you kind of thing.
But the angel scaring the guards wouldn't at that point be like right by the guard? Be up on
It would be, yeah. Yeah, I don't know how far the stone went. The language that is used is that it is significantly away. Is that 20 feet? Is that 25 feet? I don't know. Okay? But the angel's purpose in showing up and moving the stone for the guards is the angel has no concern, I think, about scaring the guards. He wants them to be really impressed. Right? When the women see the angel in the tomb, the language is the usual, don't be afraid. Right? So we get that, which, by the way, angels say a lot, don't they? Apparently. You get the don't be afraid, which apparently means that angels, generally speaking, are possibly scary, okay? But the scenario really is the angels are outside, and then by the time the women have shown up, the angels are inside, okay? But let's hold on that. We'll get to angels in a second, okay? So angels show up in the tomb. One rolls away the stone, sits on it in full glory. Guards are freaked out, fall down, almost pass out, eventually recover and run away. Right, which puts them right under the full threat of Roman execution, okay? So the angels who were attempting to be scary enough now go inside the tomb. And remember I showed you pictures of those tombs, right? You had to kind of peer in to see. And the language is almost as if they're kind of like sitting on that bench on the edge of the bench where Jesus was, right? Okay? The women show up. Now, the youngest woman in the bunch is Mary Magdalene. We already have a picture of her being kind of emotional and impetuous, right? Especially, right? She's she's very, she loved Jesus much, right? She has this sort of personality of being very over the top, right? She immediately just sees the tomb as empty, and she doesn't even go in. What does she do? She runs away back to get who? Peter and John. It's the other women, whether there's 4 others or slightly more than that, who go in. Right? So Mary's not reporting, and I saw a bunch of angels. Mary's reporting, I saw an empty what? Tomb. It's the ones that stick around that go in and see the angels. Okay? So she just goes, oh my gosh, the tomb is empty. What have they done? And she takes off back to John's house. Okay? The other women peer inside. When they peer inside, they encounter the angels. Now, much is made of number of angels. Okay? And here we go again, back with the same old thing where skeptics like to try to make contradictions where there aren't contradictions. If I say, right, I talked to Rich and Cliff and they told me, is that contradictory if I had a conversation at which Cliff and Rich were both present and Rich did all the talking, and I say, Rich told me? Are those contradictory statements? No. If Rich and Cliff are both present in the conversation and I identify that Rich was there, I am not contradicting the fact that Cliff may also be there. I would only be contradicting it if I said only Rich was what? There. But if there is two angels, by definition there is what? One angel who could talk, right? You understand? So, and it is, if you are together as a unit and I say they told me, and then another person relates it as one angel doing all the talking, right? It's normal to say Cliff and Rich told me, even if Rich did all the what? Talking. All right? So we're applying these weird standards. That's how we relate things. Okay? So the 2 angels tell them, but apparently one angel did all the talking, which would kind of be normal. Because we don't normally talk at the same time either, do we? Okay? Okay. 2 angels are inside, one does all the talking. Now, much is also made of this notion that Mark identifies this angel as a young man, dressed in white. Okay? And they say, well, Mark wrote first, and then as time went on, they mythologized the Gospels and so on, right? And they became angels. Well, not so fast, okay? John doesn't mention the angels, but guess what? John is writing from whose perspective? Mary Magdalene. Who came running back to get John? Mary Magdalene, right? John is focusing mostly on Mary's experience. And John's own experience is most closely connected to which woman's experience? Mary Magdalene. John's writing as an eyewitness to this, guys. Okay, these are personal stories. They didn't say, I heard, I heard, I heard. Mary came back to get John. Okay, who we've established is the author of, this gospel. Okay? Mark says a young man dressed in a white robe. That's the language he uses, right? Matthew says an angel whose appearance was like lightning and whose clothes were white as snow sitting in the rock. So skeptics say, aha. Mark says man, right? Matthew says what? Angel. Look at your untrustworthy Bible. There's a contradiction. Well, that's not, as we're going to see, that's not really the case, okay? So the one angel speaks to the women and tells them not to be afraid. So at this point, like I said, he's in a more subdued mode than he would have been with the guards. That makes sense. His goals are different, okay? So the angel's not talking from the rock. The angel's talking inside the tomb, and in a different manner than the appearances to the guards, which caused the guards to basically pass out from fear almost, okay? Luke has two angels in the tomb, okay? Clothes gleaming like lightning. They tell the women not to be afraid. They deliver the message. So critics, again, love to do the number of angels and this language that Mark uses as young man, and they say, aha, these stories don't really connect. Well, first thing, in the Bible, it is not uncommon to see angels identified as what? Men. The most notable story is, if you remember, when Abraham is visited by the two angels who tell him that he's going to become a dad. Remember that? Okay, they're identified as men, but he quite clearly recognizes them as what? Not regular men, right? These are angels, right? Okay, so that by itself, that language by itself is not... Yeah.
Angels are also translated as ministers,
Mm-hmm.
And that would be natural for you to look at them as
right.
men or as
right.
representatives.
Sure. But the point is, for Mark to use that language would not put him outside the bounds of normal descriptions of what we know otherwise appear as angels. Right. Okay? The whole thing of where there are two, there is one, right? If one angel is talking again, that is not contradicting the possibility that there's another one with him. It would only be contradictory if somebody said there was only one angel, and nobody says that. Okay? Same thing if one does all the talking, right? Again, if I'm with Cliff and Rich does all the talking, and I say Cliff and Rich told me, that's not speaking out of bounds. They were together, their mission was the same, right? They had a common purpose, they were there for a reason, and one did all the talking, but I can still say they told me, right? Okay. Angels can move. Okay? They can be on a rock, and they can go in a tomb. All right? In fact, I suspect they can do lots of things I can't do, okay? But they can go from the rock when they're with the guards, and then wait for the women in the tomb. That doesn't seem to be a big deal at all, okay? Okay, you guys get the idea. Okay, Mary comes back and gets John and Peter. Now, who else is at the house, at John's house? Well, Jesus' mom, remember? All right, do you really think Mary's going to run in there to the house and go, hey, Jesus' tomb is empty, the stone was way there, this is crazy, and then run out again? Or do you think Mary, mother of Jesus, is going to be like, whoa, 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 hold on. She's probably going to spend a couple minutes with her. At a minimum, she's out of breath, right? Okay, so John and Peter, however, hear what she says and what? Race to the tomb. Okay, so whether Mary stays a couple of minutes to talk to Mary, mother of Jesus, or whether Mary just can't make the run back immediately like they're going to, or that she's just not as fast as them, or all of the above, it's going to make sense that John and Peter show up without who? Mary. Right? She just made the whole run. She might not be as fast as them anyway, and she's probably going to spend a couple minutes talking to some people, especially Mary, mother of Jesus, who are there. Okay? So John and Peter race to the tomb. Who gets there first?
John.
All right, who's younger?
John.
There you go. Makes sense again, doesn't it? Right? Okay. Meanwhile, though, and remember, Johanna, who's not as familiar with the city and who's coming from a different place, her crew of women who has just seen the angels is coming back, but where they're going back to is not the same back. So it's very possible, if you look at the geography, that they don't actually pass one another directly. There's a lot of ins and outs, right? Little side streets and so on. They're heading back to the palace, presumably, right? And John and Peter are coming from John's house out that gate, right? So they probably went back the gate that they went, and these guys are probably coming out the other gate, okay? Either way. John and Peter arrive at the tomb. Now, the Gospels say that John pokes his head in, right? And it also says that John sees what? The grave clothes and believes. Now, it doesn't really specify what he believes, but it says John saw the grave clothes and believes. Now, keep in mind, the body would have been wrapped in all these spices, right? It would have been, even the hasty job they did, we know they put like 75 pounds of spices on them, right? It would have been encased in this myrrh. It would have been gummed up, right? To get somebody out of that would have been quite a project, okay? But he looks in and he sees the grave clothes sort of separated out. We said there were at least, there are 3 pieces, really. And they were sort of sitting there, even folded, okay? And John saw the grave clothes, and something about what he saw caused him to believe, all right? It wasn't that someone had moved the body, which if you're just going to move the body, you would have picked it up with what? The grave clothes still on it. The grave clothes are still there. Body is what? Gone. Okay? Peter, of course, being Peter, does what? Rushes in. By the way, is that consistent with Peter's personality? Isn't Peter always rushing in to everything? Isn't Peter always the one who opens his mouth and says whatever comes out with no filter? Always getting in trouble. Okay? So Peter runs in and sees what he sees. Okay? John and Peter then presumably, dumbfounded, head back towards John's house. Now, meanwhile, Mary has regrouped a little bit. She is still freaked out, and she is now heading back where? To the tomb. Now, the other women are gone, right? They're heading back. John and Peter are heading back, and now here comes Mary, not for the first time, but the second time. And that's how we get Mary Magdalene alone at the tomb. It's not her first visit, it's her what? Second visit. Okay? So Mary Magdalene shows up for the second time. Okay? Which means that Jesus' first recorded appearance is to whom? Mary Magdalene. Okay? Okay. We got this. Good. Now, when Mary has her first reaction to Jesus showing up, what does she think might be going on? What's her first reaction? Is her first reaction resurrection? No, her first reaction is somebody moved the what? The body. And she actually falsely assumes that Jesus, you got to picture this, she's crying her eyes out, tears clouding her vision, right? And somebody over there is talking to her. She has no expectation that that person's going to be who? In fact, the last person in the world she thinks it's going to be is who? Jesus. Okay? So she knows that Joseph, the hotshot, has this tomb and all that. She assumes, well, it's one of the guys that does the maintenance, right? The gardener. That's a reasonable assumption. A thoroughly unreasonable assumption from her perspective is this is a resurrected Jesus. And by the way, one of the best evidences of the Gospels that these are authentic is if you were going to make this up, would you make up that everybody doubted initially? I mean, if you look at later apocryphal Gospels, they're just wild, crazy stories. In these stories, they record their initial reactions genuinely, and they record things that are just embarrassing, like, I didn't think it was him, Thomas doubted, right? Mary thought it was the gardener. So not only would you not insert women as the first witnesses in first century Judea, but you have not only women, but a doubting woman. A woman who misses it, right? Who thinks it's what? The gardener. That's not the stuff you make up if you're trying to fabricate a story. Okay? You only write that because it's what? True. It's what she thought. Okay? So there is an account of Jesus showing up to the other women on the way back. It is Not clear if that's a slightly different retelling of the story of, it seems that on the way back he shows up to them separately as well, all right? There is the Emmaus Road appearances. This is all on the Sunday, which is to Cleopas, who happens to be Jesus' what? Uncle. And it says to one unnamed other. We don't know who that one unnamed other is, okay? Except I know for sure it's not Peter because of other language that shows up later, okay? There's no account of this in the Gospels itself, but it's referred to when Cleopas and the other guys show up to the disciples. They show up and say, you're not going to believe this. And the disciples basically say, yeah, we are. He's appeared to who? Peter. Okay? So Jesus was doing some appearing on this first day. Okay? Mary Magdalene, other women, shows up on the Emmaus Road. By the time these guys get to where the disciples are, right, who presumably are now together, right, which means John and Peter went to Bethany most likely, right? Okay? He shows up and they say, you're not going to believe this, what just happened to us. They said, yeah, the Lord's risen and he's appeared to who? Peter. Okay? But we don't get an actual account of that other than that there. We get a reference to that in 1 Corinthians 15. It's on the list of appearances, okay? So we have documentation that it happened. We don't get a description of it, I should say, okay? Then to the disciples without who? Thomas, who is, we don't know where Thomas is, but he wasn't there, okay? All right? Later, he appears again to the disciples, but this time who's there? Thomas, okay? And when we talk about the nature of appearances, and we talk about hallucination, and we talk about what other options besides, we're going to realize that, you know, among other things, these are multiple appearances. They're appearances over a long period of time. They're appearances in which Jesus does very physical things like eating and cooking, right? And they're appearances to many different kinds of people. And they're appearances to people who have absolutely no expectation that he's going to be doing what? Appearing, and who in fact need convincing. One of the people who needs convincing is who? Thomas, all right? Then later on, a little while later, not the same day, to 7 of the disciples while they're doing what? Fishing. And they show up on the beach and he's cooking. This is also the scene where he talks to Peter and John and restores Peter. He has lengthy conversations with Peter and John about their futures. And basically tells Peter, this is how you're going to die. To which Peter responds, what about him? Right? And then they so this is not like, some sort of phantasmal thing where he sort of shows up for, did you see that? He's there for like hours. Okay? This is not described in the Gospels, but it is on the list of appearances that is in 1 Corinthians 15, chapter 3, and that it has great explanatory power. Because there is no more interesting case than James, brother of Jesus, who is nowhere to be found in this story at all. And in fact, the only time we ever see him in the Gospels, he's doubting his brother, thinks his brother's nuts, right? And then after the resurrection appearances, and one of which is specifically supposedly to him, he becomes the leader of the Jerusalem church and is martyred for his faith and stoned to death. And we know that to be true, and that happens in the 62 AD. Okay? So you have people who are completely not inclined to believe this at all, who then go out and die for it. Okay? There is a reference in Corinthians to 500 at one time. Okay? And I'd just like to point out that's a very large number. And with that reference comes the admonition that most of these people at the time of writing, which was 55 AD when he wrote 1 Corinthians, most of these people were still what? Alive, and you could go ask them. Okay? And then lastly, the reference is in 1 Corinthians to Paul. He says, as to me, as one untimely born, right, to me. And of course, Paul's just like James. Paul's even better than James. Paul goes from what? The number one persecutor of Christianity to what? The number one missionary. And his explanation is, I saw a risen Christ. Okay? Next time we're going to get into it, we're going to get into some more details on the seal, the stone, the guards, tomb security, And we'll head into that. We'll analyze these appearances with some more depth. Okay, Rich, can you take us out?
Heavenly Father, we thank you for this presentation. We pray that you would give us wisdom and understanding these things. We pray, Father, that you would help more people to realize the importance of attending these services, that they might too be believers. We know Sunday school is a very important time in the church, and we pray that more people might be interested in coming here and hearing the message. We pray, Father, you would bless each one of us as we hear these things, that we may apply